Start. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Queen takes pawn. The checks are rook to e1, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to e1, check. King to h2. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes rook. Queen to h6, check. King to g1. Queen takes rook, check. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Rook takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Bishop takes pawn, check. King to h7. Bishop takes rook, check. King to g8. Bishop takes bishop. Next, threats in this position are pawn takes pawn, check. The checks are queen to g7, check. Queen to h8, check. Pawn takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is pawn takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. Queen to e6, check. King to g7. Queen takes bishop. Queen to d1, check. Rook to f3. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are bishop takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to e8, check. Queen to e6, check. Queen to e5, check. Queen to e4, check. Queen to d2, check. Queen to d1, check. Queen to a5, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook to e8, check. Bishop to e2. Rook takes bishop, check. King takes rook. Bishop to a6, check. Let's continue. The threats are queen takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen to h6, check. Queen to h4, check. Queen to g4, check. Queen to f3, check. Queen to g5, check. Queen to f5, check. Queen to e5, check. The answer is queen to g5, check. King to f3. Queen to f5, check. King to e2. Rook to e8, check. King to d2. Rook takes rook. King takes rook. Queen to b1, check. King to e2. Queen takes bishop, check. Another one. The threats are queen takes rook. Queen takes queen. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes bishop. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to c7, check. Queen to d7, check. Queen to e7, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to f6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e5, check. Queen to d4, check. Rook to e7, check. Answer to this puzzle is knight to d7. Queen takes knight. Rook to e7, check. King to h6. Rook takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop, check. Rook takes rook. Rook takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The answer is rook takes rook. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. King to g8. Queen takes rook, check. King takes queen. Rook takes bishop, check. Bishop to f6, check. Knight to c3. One more. The threats are pawn takes pawn, check. The checks are pawn takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. King to h6. Pawn takes pawn. f5, check. King takes pawn. Rook to f1, check. Another puzzle. Here are the threats. Bishop takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn. Here are the checks. Bishop takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook, check. Queen to d5, check. The best move in puzzle position is bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Queen to e4, check. Rook to f5. Knight takes rook. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are queen takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to h6, check. Queen to f6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e7, check. Queen to d8, check. f4, check. h4, check. The puzzle is solved using knight to g3, h4, f4, check. King takes pawn. Queen to h6, check. g5. Knight to h5, check. King to e3. Queen takes rook, check. Next, threats in this position are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using king to d7, g3, bishop to h3, queen to h4, bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop, e3, check. King to e2, bishop to g4, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Rook takes queen. Let's continue. The threats are queen takes pawn. Queen takes bishop, check. Queen takes knight. Here are checks in puzzle position. h3, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Queen to f2, check. Queen to g1, check. Queen to e2, check. Queen to d2, check. Answer to this puzzle is h3, check. King takes pawn. Queen takes bishop, check. King to h4. Queen takes knight. Queen to d7. Queen to e1, check. King to g5. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to f5, check. Queen takes queen, check. Pawn takes queen. f3. One more. Here are the threats. Rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Bishop to c8, check. Rook to f6, check. Rook to c5, check. g4, check. Rook to e5, check. Solution to the puzzle is bishop to c8, check. King to g5. h4, check. King takes pawn. g3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Pawn takes queen, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in this position are rook takes knight. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. The checks are bishop takes pawn, check. Bishop to c3, check. The puzzle is solved using rook takes knight. Queen takes rook. Bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Queen to d4, check. Another one. Threats in this position are rook takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are rook takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook to d7. Queen to b3. Queen to a8. King to f8. Rook takes rook. King takes rook. Rook takes rook, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop. The checks are knight to f3, check. The answer is knight to f3, check. Pawn takes knight. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop to e2. Bishop takes bishop. Rook to e1. Rook takes pawn. King takes rook. Bishop to d4, check. King to g3. Bishop to e5, check. Bishop to f4. Bishop takes queen. Rook takes bishop. Queen to d7. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop. Here are the checks. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen to h1, check. Queen to f1, check. Answer to this puzzle is bishop takes pawn, check. Bishop to d2. Queen to h1, check. Queen to f1. Bishop takes bishop, check. King takes bishop. e3, check. Another one. Threats in this position are knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is rook takes pawn. King takes rook. Bishop takes pawn, check. King to g8. Bishop to h7, check. King to h8. Rook to h1. Rook to f6. g5. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Bishop takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook takes pawn. Knight to f4. Rook takes queen. Bishop takes rook. Bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Queen takes knight, check. Another one. Here are threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. The checks are bishop takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Knight to g5, check. King to h6. Queen to d3. f5. Pawn takes pawn. Another puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Here are the checks. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight to e2, check. The answer is knight takes pawn. King takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. King to g1. Rook to f4. Rook to e3. Rook takes knight. Rook takes queen. Rook takes queen. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Next, threats in puzzle position are. There are no threats in this position. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to g2, check. Queen to h1, check. Queen to c1, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen to c1, check. King to g2. Bishop to h3, check. King takes bishop. g4, check. King to h4. Bishop takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to e7, check. Queen takes rook, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Rook to f1, check. King to g8. Queen takes rook, check. King to h7. Queen to e4, check. Next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Queen takes bishop. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are. Rook takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using. Rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Queen to g5, check. King to h7. Rook takes bishop. Queen to e5. Rook to g3. Queen takes rook. Queen takes queen. Another puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Knight takes bishop. Queen takes bishop, check. Bishop takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Knight to d6, check. Knight to e7, check. Queen takes bishop, check. The best move in puzzle position is. Knight takes bishop. Queen takes knight. Queen to a3. Rook to d8. Bishop takes pawn. Queen to d6. Bishop takes bishop, check. King takes bishop. Rook takes pawn, check. King to c8. Queen takes pawn. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.